Hey, welcome back to my channel. So I built these two nightstands and I wanted to go for a really classic look, but with all the modern features. So this has wireless charging capabilities with the ability to adapt this in the future. So as our phones change and our chargers change, we can change it. And I wanted to keep a sturdy top. So in order to get the wireless chargers to work, you have to get the wood down to 1/8 of an inch. And I know myself, and it really needs to be loosey-proof if I'm going to build something. So if I have 1/8 of an inch on the top of something, I'm pretty much guaranteed to end up cracking it at some point because I'll do something stupid. That's just who I am. So I didn't want anything on the top. I wanted to be able to keep a nice solid 1-inch top. So the wireless charging is actually going to be in the shelf, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And then we have full power port back here. And so we have all those modern conveniences. But again, I just wanted to keep a really nice classic look. All right, so these nightstands took a lot of steps and a lot of time. So I'm going to do a series of videos on it. In this first video, I just want to do this as an idea video. So I know if you're like me, sometimes you're watching videos just to get ideas, and sometimes you're watching for detailed instructions on how to do a step. Well, you might already know how to cut the dovetails and stuff, so you may not be interested in those videos. But this video, I just want to give you a quick tour and a very, very brief step-by-step introduction to how I made these nightstands. So I definitely wanted wireless charging, but I built these to last forever. And our phones aren't always going to look like this, and our chargers aren't always going to work the same. So I wanted to be able to adapt this with time. So this first board in this shelf is actually not attached to anything. It's on a little shelf. It's a really, really tight fit, so you would never be able to just move it accidentally. But if you give it a couple good taps from underneath, I can remove this board and then I can rebuild it or modify it as our technology changes. And even though I tested this a lot, the first time when it was all assembled, it was still a little stressful setting the phone into its little groove here and making sure that it actually works. Here you can see that I'm charging my phone, my iPad, my Kindle, and my Fitbit all at one time. And this is what it looks like without it all lit up, so you barely even notice that I have all of these items in here. From the top, you can see that I still have an outlet open in case I want to add a lamp or something else. I made dovetail drawers on my Incra Ultra Jig, and I had never actually made drawers on this before, so I decided to start with that in case my dimensions ended up a little bit off. I had confidence that I could build a cabinet to an exact size more than perhaps the drawer. I originally planned on making 2 plates that would just be removed, but then I decided to make a continuous board, but I did make a set like this and did it with just the hand router. And then the second set, when I did the boards, I made the template and stuff for the router table, mostly just because I really didn't like all the dust flying at me with the hand router. I will give a lot more details on this step in the video that's going to specifically cover the electronics portion of the nightstands. I was lucky enough to find these massive pieces of oak. They were solid 12 inches wide and really quite flat and beautiful, so I'm going to use these for the top. I cut these down in width to assure that the seam would be right in the center, and the grain pattern worked out so fantastic that I can't even really tell where the seam is at all. While the tops were drying, I moved on to the frame, and adding the arch to it was kind of a last-minute decision, and I'm happy that I did. It allows me a little bit more room to reach into that shelf. And so I'm just marking out some points to use as a reference, and I'm going to use this flexible router guide simply to draw an arch. I'm not going to actually make a template because there's just 2 of them, and it's just as fast for me to just cut it at the bandsaw and sand it for this purpose. So after I had this drawn on there, I taped the 2 pieces together so that when I went to the bandsaw, I only had to cut this once and they would match perfectly. And then I just sanded them out, and it worked very smoothly that way. When laying out my frames, I prefer to use spacer blocks instead of measuring as much as possible. This assures that everything ends up just perfect, and I can make sure that the other nightstand also matches perfectly because I'm going to use the exact same blocks. So the first frame, I did dowels for the top and bottom rails and pocket holes for the middle 2. And then I realized, it's not really structural anyway, and pocket holes, since I have a Craig Foreman, are just a lot faster for me. And so on the second one, I just used just the pocket holes. If the rails had been just a little bit wider, I probably would have just used biscuits, but they were slightly too narrow to use biscuits. So once the glue set for a little bit, I flipped it over and then I put the pocket hole screws in. It probably honestly would be strong enough even without the screws for those two middle rails because they don't provide much structure anyway. There are always multiple ways to do the same thing. So these were constructed slightly differently, they look exactly the same. As I was trimming down my final pieces of plywood, I noticed that my shot, well, still kind of stinks. Next, I marked out the spots on the back of the shelf to run a groove so that the cord would be able to lie nice and tight up into that shelf. I made 3 different levels of depth within the groove so that it would be able to accommodate the part that plugs right in, but by the end it would be a very shallow groove so I didn't lose any of the integrity of the board. On the back of the shelf, I had to mark out the spots for the outlet to go in, as well as the hole so that the wire can feed up from the wireless charging station and be plugged into this outlet. I drilled some starter holes because I'll use a jigsaw to cut out the rectangle, and then of course I drilled the big hole for the wire. This old Black & Decker jigsaw was probably one of the first tools that I ever purchased. I think it was like a Walmart purchase or a pawn shop or something. It was really cheap, but it still gets the job done. But apparently I learned don't put the camera on the same table that you are jigsawing. So enjoy the bumpy ride. To make sure that this stays straight and exactly where I want it, I'm using a self-centering drill bit, and I'll be using that throughout many parts of this project, and they are extremely handy. The main cabinet I made out of oak plywood, and it's just a pretty basic box, and then the frame is going to be attached to the front of this. For the permanent portion of the shelf, I just used a few pocket holes that are going to be run in from underneath. The shelf is an extremely snug fit, so I'm first just getting everything dry fit together. Next, I'm just making a little shelf for that front piece to sit on, and it's very, very tight in there. So again, I'd have to actually kind of tap it out with a mallet to get it out, but this will assure that it could never drift downward after, putting your phone on and off. I assured that the shelf was nice and square, and then I secured it with the pocket hole screws. I attached the front frame with glue and clamps, and that's going to be plenty strong enough. There was no need for any fasteners here. Wood glue is much stronger than it often gets credit for. I stained everything with special walnut, and I'm really happy with just how subtle the phone spot ended up on the shelf. The drawer fronts are going to be inset, so I just creeped up on the sizing. So you can see here that I'm still just slightly too big, and then I'm going to get it trimmed down to be exactly perfect. I'm going to have a 1/16 of an inch space all the way around the drawer. These little handy shims have been extremely helpful in my shop, and they were awesome for getting the drawers in just right. I'll attach a link to the shims in the description. I pre-drilled the holes for the handles of the drawers, and this made installing them much easier. I attached the drawer slides flush with the bottom of the drawer, and then I used this Rockler jig for installing the drawer slides on the side, and this was extremely helpful and very slick to use. It's always fun putting the drawer in the first time and realizing that yes, everything actually does fit right. So once the drawer was in, I was just able to put the drawer front back in and use my little handy shims again, and I'm using the 1/16 inch shims, and get this placed just right. And then I actually just ran a couple of screws right in through the holes that I already had drilled, and that's going to help to hold it secure enough until I can get screws in from the back. Okay, and if you're not able to reach in and screw it in, like I was able to for the bottom ones, you want to just take that drawer up very carefully and then apply a couple of clamps, because of course it still could move as far as, the difference of the holes versus the actual screw itself. Now that the drawer front is secured, it's really easy to just remove the screws, finish drilling the hole all the way through, and then install the handle. I will be doing a video that goes into a lot greater detail on building the drawers as well as installing the drawers. The soft close feature is oddly satisfying to me. Next, I cut the top so that I'll be able to apply those hinges and be able to get to the electronics in the back. I want basically a half circle in both of the backs, so I'm going to just clamp the two back pieces together and then drill one hole so that each of them ends up with that half circle. I sanded out both circles to make sure that they were nice and smooth. I applied some trim with glue and clamps, and for the center piece, the pieces were nice and flat, so I was able to get by with just clamping them on with some tape, and once the glue dries, that will do the rest of the work. I stained the rest of the cabinet. Next, I removed the drawer so that I'd be able to install the wireless charging. I attached the charger using hot glue like I've seen done before, and I realized that my little glue gun was extremely old and really not very great, but I was able to make it work. And this was the first moment of truth. To install the back hinges, I first scored the area that I wanted to remove and started with a chisel, and quickly realized that a router was just going to be a little bit easier and more consistent given the chisels that I have. And I took everything apart and I put on several coats of lacquer. I applied the hinges and back pieces first, just in case I'd need to make any slight adjustments to where the front of it went. I used figure 8 fasteners to apply the top in case I had any wood movement, and then for the front I just pre-drilled some holes and ran screws in from up underneath. I'm using a right angle attachment in order to be able to get into this very small space and still be able to drive these screws in. So once the tops are on, these are ready to bring into my house, load up, charge all of my electronics, and hopefully enjoy for the rest of my life. So, stay tuned for the videos that are going to go into a little bit more detail, and have a great time building.